My dad was born in 1918 in Whiting, Indiana. When he was a boy, the sound of a car coming up the road brought poor kids like him running out to watch as that miracle contraption shot by at the speed of a galloping horse, throwing dust and gravel from its tires. His father and mother divorced when he and his brother Ralph Jr. were just boys. They sort of raised each other, getting into every form of creative mischief available to them. They'd find a popular mechanics magazine and set to building all manner of fun stuff from whatever they could scrounge up in the neighborhood. When I was 9 or 10, I used to love quizzing him about all the things he built. A sailplane that he raced on frozen lakes, a crossbow built of a leaf spring with a trigger mechanism carved from a billiard ball, bombs, telescopes, radios, all kinds of things. I was raised in an outer suburb of Los Angeles in the 1960s, and stories of my dad's youth sounded like adventures from another world. You see, after he'd grown up and spent his military service training other Navy pilots to fight in Germany and Japan, he and his buddy Joe Hayes went out to California. He tracked down his own dad, made whatever piece he needed to make, and settled down. Joe married Sheila, one of Grandpa Ralph's 2 daughters, from his second marriage. And my dad married Lorraine, my mom, one of Sheila's friends from high school. So Dad and Joe went off on an adventure, met a couple of babes, and became brothers-in-law. This is a picture of my dad with his dad out here in California. I'm pretty sure that the gun is not loaded. Here's another pic of him a few years earlier, I think. He was a handsome devil, wasn't he? Joe Hayes went to his reward in his 40s, a victim of lymphoma. It was my first brush with the reality of death, watching one of my 2 big, strong role models beaten down by disease. 20 years later, my dad fought that same battle, but the technology that had been exploding all around him throughout his life allowed him to beat that cancer. He was younger then than I am now. He lived another 30 years. He ended up being a stand-in dad for Joe's 3 kids. Also for the Gibson kids, neighbors of ours who lost their dad around that same time. It wasn't until my father's memorial service that I realized how important he'd been in the lives of a lot of young guys. They were now grown men with families of their own. One by one, they eulogized him, telling how he'd taken them under a wing when they'd needed guidance. Young men he'd met through work or church or just by random circumstance. I listened to them and I felt a combination of pride in my father and remorse that I'd never known the half of his impact on the world. He wasn't the kind of guy who would ever have mentioned that sort of thing. He and my mother were modest people. Mostly I felt grateful to these men for fleshing out that part of my dad I'd never known. By the way, I should tell you his name was Don. Families take odd trajectories. My father came from a broken home. He produced an intact home. I came from an intact home, and sadly, I produced a broken home. By all indications, my own kids have the talent for relationships that I apparently lack. So do the Gibson kids and the Hayes kids. Maybe losing a father does something to a kid that makes them hang on tighter to a spouse. I never lost my dad until I was a grown man, and my character was set, for better or worse. But I did come close. My parents were very nearly divorced. There was a period of time when they argued fiercely. I know that my dad had trouble adjusting to working hard all week and raising a house full of kids. He had the heart of an adventurer, and he struggled with the workaday world. She'd say something to set him off, and us kids would lie awake, listening to them arguing in loud whispers. Something was coming to a head. Something needed to be done. They separated, and my pop moved to a little apartment in Burbank close to his job. I was 12 years old, and it was decided that I was at that particular age where a boy needed time with his father. And so for that year, I enjoyed in-depth dad time. We explored ghost towns out in the desert. We hiked into abandoned mine shafts with flashlights. We camped under the stars at Lake Elsinore, lying on cots while my dad pointed out the constellations in the sky. We went down to Mexico because I had a hankering for a fringe buckskin vest and he figured we could find one in Tijuana. We all saw Dad every weekend, but about once a month, I had him all to myself for a couple of days. Field trips for just the 2 of us, full of talk and ideas, and travel to destinations based on the slightest whim. I learned later that he had sought the counsel of a particular priest, and when he moved back home, it was clear that something had changed inside him. I never again heard him raise his voice to my mother. He had decided to forgive her her failings, and forgive her he did. He accepted that now and again she would bait him, and that it was up to him to resist the pull of frustration and anger. Eventually, she just stopped trying to pick fights, and the two of them lived in peace from then on. He did that for his kids. He had vowed to give us the family he hadn't had, and by God, he delivered on that promise. I'll tell you more about him some other Father's Day. But now I want to share a song with you that I wrote for him. In his late 80s, he contracted a form of Parkinson's disease. Not the kind that causes tremors, but the kind that made his muscles stiff and unresponsive. At first, the symptoms came and went, allowing him to rally for a while. One day I met my brother Kevin over at the folks' house. Dad had gone for a drive. We waited out front for him, knowing he'd park under the shade trees that he had long ago planted there himself. And when he did, he practically skipped up the front walk, ignoring the handrail that my other brother had recently built for him. I leaned over to Kevin and said, "Looks like the old man's come back pretty strong." Kevin said, "For now." I wrote this song soon after that and burned it on a CD. I dropped it off one day saying, "Here's a little song I wrote for you, Pop. Give it a listen." I set the CD player on the table next to his easy chair and went to run some errands. When I came back, he was standing in the kitchen in the old green bathrobe he wore when he couldn't get his pants on. His eyes were red. He said, "You made me cry, Dave." We hugged each other. And then we never mentioned it again because we were guys and that's how we roll. I hope you like my dad's song, and I hope you have a wonderful Father's Day. Feel free to tell your own stories in the comments. Well, it can't be more than 10 years ago he was out there climbing trees. Chainsaw in his hand, tied off with the rope around his waist. Knocking limbs into the yard, yelling, "Put those dogs away." Sweat and laughter rolling off his face. And it can't be 10 years before that I made my girl my wife. He drove up for the wedding. We built the fence around the yard to the ragged, jagged rhythm of hammers coming down, never so at ease as when we were working hard. Well, I don't know why I thought he'd be different. Time takes even the great ones out one by one. I don't know, this could be his last go-round. But the old man's come back pretty strong for now. You know, the flu killed 50 million in the year that he was born. Europe lay in tatters at the waning of the war. But in the fall, an armistice brought every doughboy home. And Babe and the Red Sox showed the Cubs the door. It wasn't everything and then some kind of century in a young and cocky nation, so confident and proud. Armstrong kicked up moon dust 30 years after my dad spun barrel rolls in a biplane through the clouds. I don't know why I thought he'd be different. Time takes even the great ones out one by one. I don't know, this could be his last go-round. But the old man's come back pretty strong for now. Well, I haven't come here to sanctify him or to make him out a saint. Gloss him up or dress him up in the images of myth. We all hit golden straightaways, firing on all eight. And we all have demons that we travel with. Well, Well, he's smaller in his clothes now, and he stands on shaky legs. That old pump in his chest can't keep up with the demand. It's good we take the long view, the noble and the small, the good and bad, when adding up a man. Well, I don't know why I thought he'd be different, but I did. Time takes even the great ones out, one by one. I don't know, well, this could be his last go-round. But the old man's come back pretty strong for now. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel and then click the little bell to get notifications.